Hello. So in this video I'm going to talk to you about Aristophanes' play Frogs. So like Thesmophorus, Frogs is a very metatheatrical play. It's very much centered on the art of tragedy, which is somewhat ironic for Aristophanes, who is, of course, a comic playwright. But Frogs tells the story of Dionysus's journey to the underworld in the mold of Heracles to retrieve the soul of Euripides after Euripides has died and bring him back to save tragic playwriting in the world. Once Dionysus gets to the underworld, he finds that there is a contest between Euripides and Aeschylus over who is the best playwright. So we find this out sort of midway through. There's two servants, Xanthias, who's Dionysus' servant who's come with him, and Aeschylus, who's a servant who's just there, somebody just around. And so Aeschylus says, "There's a statute on our books that the most skillful craftsmen in each art, I mean the fine arts, poetry and such, be asked to dinner at the city hall and have a chair by Pluto's side." Xanthias, "I see." Aeschylus, "Until a better artist in that line appears among us, then he has to move." Xanthias, But why should this have worried Aeschylus?" Aeschylus, "The tragic throne was naturally his as being master of his trade." Xanthias, "Who else?" Aeschylus, "Well, when Euripides appeared, of course, he started showing off to the underworld. Pickpockets, gangsters, burglars, parricides, and we've a lot of them around here. Went wild over his fancy footwork in debate and cheered him as the champ. That turned his head, and thereupon he claimed the right to sit where Aeschylus had sat." And so this is the sort of basis of the second half or so of the play, which is a debate between Euripides and Aeschylus over who's the better playwright. And actually the brief introduction in this version, the Signet, or the Bantam Classics edition, calls this one of the earliest pieces of recorded literary criticism, and that's quite fair. But before I talk about the arguments that each of these playwrights make in favor of their own work and against the other's work, I want to talk about a few of the sort of preliminary meta-theatrical components, because we have meta-theater here. We have exploration of what it means to perform and to present theater even before we get to that debate. So one of the earliest things, when Dionysus and Xanthias first enter, the underworld, that is, they've been warned ahead of time by Heracles that there's going to be some horrible beasts and things that they're going to have to navigate their way past. And so once they get to that, there's a moment here where Dionysus says, "Save me, your eminence, till supper time." And he's talking to the priest of his cult. Because remember, these plays originally were performed at religious festivals in ancient Greece, and Dionysus was the patron saint, not patron saint, but the patron deity of theater. And so the priest of Dionysus would naturally be in attendance in a prominent place. And so here we have Dionysus appealing not just to the audience, which Aristophanes does across a number of his plays, but appealing to a specific individual in the audience. The other component of meta-theater that we have before the debate itself is switching of costumes. So Dionysus, in order to make it easier for him to get to the underworld, has dressed up like Heracles with a lion skin and a club, which were the traditional accoutrements of Heracles. But Dionysus is not particularly keen on taking on wild beasts. He's not particularly keen on paying Heracles' debts from when Heracles went to the underworld and ate a bunch of food and things like this. So he several times gets Xanthias to switch clothes with him. So Dionysus says, all right then, since you are a dauntless soul, this is after Xanthias says he wouldn't be afraid of these things, with such a hero complex, you be me, put on the lion skin and take the club, and I will tote the baggage for a change. Xanthias, no sooner said than done, your word is law. Well, look me over. Xanthias, Heracles, you'll see a better brand of spunk than yours. So we get this, and then slightly later, we actually have a sort of return to this theme, but in this sort of question of naming, because they switch back and forth a couple of times. When it looks like friends of Heracles are around, Dionysus wants to be Heracles. When it looks like people who he owes money to, or who aren't fans of him, want to be around, then Dionysus wants Xanthias to be Heracles. But there's also this sort of controversy over naming, where Dionysus, at one point, when Dionysus is trying to convince Xanthias to take on the lion skin and club, Xanthias calls him Heracles, and Dionysus says, don't call me that, it's dangerous, basically. And Xanthias says, all right, Dionysus, and Dionysus says, that's even worse. But we get eventually to the debate between Euripides and Aeschylus over who's the better playwright. And there's a lot of detail here in terms of like the structures of lines, the way that language is chosen, the complexity or accessibility of language, etc., etc. It's partially very difficult because a lot of the lines that they take apart, and they do a lot of that, where the playwrights will quote particular lines of their poetry, and then the other will say, here's why that line is bad, or something like this. Part of the problem is that we're getting these lines in translation, and so the literary analysis is much trickier, because, for instance, a lot of times Greek playwrights will use words with double meanings. So you might use a word that, for instance, I can't think of a specific example off the top of my head, but you might use a word with a double meaning in Greek that doesn't translate over into English. And so that idea of like, we're taking a close, specific look at this language is a lot trickier in translation. But we do have a couple of major ideas that each playwright comes down on. So Aeschylus comes down on this idea that theater, and tragedy especially, should have a pedagogical function. It should teach people how to be good citizens. It should teach people to be devoted to their city-state. It should teach people military virtues and things like this. Euripides, on the other hand, comes down, and also Aeschylus says tragedy should be linguistically beautiful. It should be elevated, and it should speak to the intellect. It should speak to the critical capacity of the audience. Euripides, on the other hand, believes that theater has a responsibility to tell the truth, to be accurate, and not necessarily to instill virtues or to model behavior. He also thinks that theater should be linguistically accessible. The audience should be able to easily understand what it is that the characters are saying, rather than having to work and think and figure out what the meaning of sort of elevated poetry is. So we get this a little bit. Aeschylus accuses Euripides of creating negative portraits of women, particularly his decision to stage women like Phaedra or Medea. And so Euripides, and that's also actually a sort of throwback to one of the themes of Thesmophoria Suze, where the big bone of contention is, does Euripides present women negatively? Although Aeschylus' argument here is somewhat different. But Euripides says, "And Phaedra, you think that her story is false, imagined by me a mere fiction?" Aeschylus responds, "Unhappily no, she is real. But a poet should seek to avoid the depiction of evil, should hide it, not drag into view its ugly and odious features. For children have tutors to guide them aright, young manhood has poets for teachers, and so we must write of the fair and the good." And so this is sort of one of the key distinctions here in this contest is what should be the function of dramatic poetry or tragic poetry. Should the function be to model good, proper behavior, or should it be to present the gritty truth? Dionysus is put in charge of judging this contest between the two playwrights, and ultimately he settles on Aeschylus as the winner, even though he had initially come down to get Euripides. Dionysus is ultimately sold on the idea that theater should have a teaching function. And so we get this sort of final, or nearly final, summation by the chorus, which says, "Happy is the man of intellect keen, in cases many is this principle seen. Proven to possess an intelligent brain, Aeschylus goes back home again, to his fellow citizens to be a boon likewise upon his own kith and kin, all for his sagacity. Better it is to eschew loquacity, following in the Socratic train, rejecting music with high disdain, abandoning with foolish equanimity noble tragedy's lofty sublimity. To make your study grandiloquence, and busy quibbling devoid of sense, argues an empty mind and sick, in point of fact a lunatic." And so we have ultimately this sort of judgment on tragic poetry that it should be clear and accessible, but it also should be moral. It should actually teach proper virtues. But there's one more thing I do want to say about this, because this play has some of the best literary insults that I've ever heard. So I just want to share just a couple of those, a couple of my favorite ones. Euripides says, so in reference to Aeschylus, Euripides says, "I know the fellow, know him through and through. Arrogant, wanton, savage that he is, of speech unbridled, passionate, unfenced, a ranting, pompous portmanteaulogist," which I think is great. A ranting, pompous portmanteaulogist. But Aeschylus replies, "What, scion of the mistress of the peas, you scoff at me, cliché anthologist, maker of ragamuffin mannequins?" So again, some great literary insults that you can, use at cocktail parties when discussing unfashionable writers.